David Monroe was the kind of man others admired and envied in equal measure. At 42 years old, his life had become a symbol of success in every way imaginable. He lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, had built a tech empire from the ground up, and was frequently featured on magazine covers as a shining example of entrepreneurial genius. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and the ceaseless pursuit of the next milestone. Yet, for all his accomplishments, there was a strange emptiness gnawing at him. He was single, unattached, and had no time for relationships. The fleeting romances of his youth had faded into distant memories. His focus had always been on the next achievement, the next project that would cement his legacy. But with each passing year, David found it harder to ignore the creeping sense of disconnection from the world around him. He had everything, yet somehow it felt like he had nothing. Every day without fail, David walked the same route from his penthouse to his office. It was part of his routine, a brief reprieve from the constant noise of his life. The streets were bustling with people, most of whom he never noticed, and who never noticed him. But lately, his eyes had started to land on the same person as he passed, a homeless woman sitting on the corner of the block near his office. She sat there every morning, her clothes frayed and worn, her face marked with the weathering of someone who had spent too many nights out in the cold. She never spoke, only held up a small cardboard sign asking for help. Like many others, David barely glanced her way at first. She was just part of the background, a shadow in the periphery of his well-ordered life. But something about her was different. Every day as he passed, he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. He couldn't place it, couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he knew her. It made him uncomfortable, and he would quicken his pace, telling himself that it was ridiculous, just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the days went on, that strange, nagging feeling grew stronger. Who was she? And why did she seem so familiar? One brisk fall morning, as David made his way past the same street corner, he caught her eyes. For the first time, they locked gazes. Her eyes, though tired and clouded with age, held a glimmer of recognition. The moment was brief, but it was enough to unsettle him. He walked faster, eager to put distance between them, but the encounter stayed with him throughout the day. Back in his office, David found it impossible to concentrate. He sat behind his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The woman's face burned into his mind. The look in her eyes. There was something there, something he couldn't quite place. He thought about it all through his meetings, during phone calls, and even on his drive home later that evening. That night, as he lay in bed, the thought refused to let him go. Who was she? Why did he feel like he knew her? He had seen hundreds of people on his walks to the office, yet none had left an impression like she had. It was as if there was an invisible thread connecting them, a thread he couldn't explain or understand. By the next morning, David's curiosity had grown to the point where he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know more about her. As he made his way to the office, his eyes searched the street corner, scanning for her familiar figure. There she was, in the same spot, holding the same sign. David slowed as he approached. This time he stopped. She looked up at him, her expression wary but curious, as if she, too, was trying to figure out why he had paused. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. David blinked, realizing how odd he must look, standing there staring at her. "I'm sorry," he stammered, trying to pull himself together. I've seen you here a lot. Do I know you?" The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment. Then, without missing a beat, she shrugged. "Maybe," she said quietly. "It's a big city. People cross paths all the time." Her response was dismissive, but the look in her eyes told him something different. She knew him, or at least she thought she did. David opened his mouth to say more but stopped himself. What was he doing? Why was he pressing this? He had meetings to get to, deals to close. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt rooted to the spot. After a moment, he forced himself to walk away, but as he headed to his office, he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The encounter weighed heavily on David's mind for the rest of the day. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was hiding something, or that she knew something about him that he didn't. It was unnerving, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about her. That evening, instead of returning home right away, David took a detour back toward the street where she always sat. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets grew quieter, David found her still there, sitting in the same place, wrapped in an old, tattered coat against the evening chill. This time, he approached her with purpose. He stood before her, feeling oddly vulnerable, unsure of what to say. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. "Why do I feel like I know you?" David asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The woman didn't respond right away. She looked at him for a long moment, then her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "You've probably passed by 100 people like me," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "People you don't even notice." David frowned. "No," he said, shaking his head. "This is different. I can't explain it, but I feel like we've met before." The woman's eyes flickered, a flash of something unreadable crossing her face. Then just as quickly her expression hardened. "We all have our ghosts," she said, her voice edged with something almost like bitterness. "Sometimes they come back to haunt us." David was taken aback by her words. There was something more to what she was saying, but he couldn't quite grasp it. He opened his mouth to ask her what she meant, but before he could, she spoke again. "Go home," she said, waving him away. "There's nothing for you here." David stood there, unsure of what to do. He wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in her tone told him that now wasn't the time. He nodded, slowly stepping back. As he turned to leave, the woman called after him. "You might not remember me, David," she said softly, "but I remember you." David froze mid-step, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned back toward her, but the woman had already looked away, retreating back into the shadows, as if their conversation had never happened. The words haunted David all night. "You might not remember me, but I remember you." Who was she? How did she know his name? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. How could a homeless woman know anything about him? And why was she so familiar? The next morning, David found himself retracing his steps, almost compelled to seek her out again. This time, he was determined to get answers. When he arrived at the street corner, however, she wasn't there. Her usual spot was empty, the only trace of her presence being a folded cardboard sign left abandoned by the curb. David bent down to pick it up. The words were scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Homeless. Need help. God bless." Frustration welled up inside him. She was gone, just as he was starting to get closer to figuring out who she was. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus on his work. He called off meetings, shut down his email, and paced his office, his mind spinning in circles. Later that evening, David found himself at his computer, combing through old records, news articles, anything he could find from his past that might give him a clue about her identity. He searched through lists of people he'd gone to college with, business associates, old acquaintances. Nothing seemed to fit. But then, buried deep in a pile of old press clippings from over a decade ago, he found a name that stopped him cold. Rachel Porter. David stared at the name, his mind racing. He knew that name. They had been in college together, once shared classes. She had been a rising star in the tech world, a brilliant entrepreneur who had been on the verge of launching her own company when everything fell apart. He hadn't heard about her in years. As the pieces began to fall into place, David realized with a sinking feeling why she had seemed so familiar. The homeless woman, Rachel, was the same woman he had once known, someone who had been poised for success, only to vanish into obscurity. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Rachel wasn't just a stranger. She had been part of his past, part of a world he thought he had left behind. But how had she ended up on the streets? What had happened to her life? David knew he had to find her again, and this time, he wouldn't leave without answers. David couldn't stop thinking about Rachel Porter. How had someone so brilliant, someone once full of promise, ended up homeless? The question gnawed at him, and the guilt that had begun to surface in his chest only deepened. He had to find her, to understand what had happened. The next morning, David set out earlier than usual, hoping to find Rachel at her usual spot. As he turned the corner to the street where she normally sat, He felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. He didn't know what he would say or how she would respond, but he had to know. This time, she was there, sitting in the same place, her coat pulled tight around her to ward off the morning chill. David slowed as he approached, but Rachel didn't look up. It was as if she was expecting him. "You came back," she said quietly, her voice rougher than before. "I did," David replied, his heart pounding. "Rachel, I remember you." At the sound of her name, Rachel's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. David took a deep breath, kneeling down so that he was at eye level with her. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice thick with the weight of the question. "I was someone," she interrupted, her tone sharp but tired. "But that was a long time ago." David stared at her, feeling the gravity of her words. "I read about you," he continued. "You had a startup, a brilliant idea. What happened?" Rachel's eyes, which had been fixed on the pavement, finally met his. The bitterness and pain in them made David's stomach churn. "What happened?" she repeated, her voice almost mocking. "Life happened, David. You wouldn't understand. You've always had everything. People like me, we don't get that luxury." David wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he knew it wasn't the time. Instead, he stayed silent, giving her the space to continue. "My company, my dream. It all fell apart. I made mistakes, trusted the wrong people. And then, well, it doesn't take long to fall when the world stops caring about you." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I lost everything. My investors pulled out, and the debts piled up. I tried to fight, but I couldn't keep up. Before I knew it, I was out on the streets." David's heart sank as he listened. This wasn't the story he had expected, but it was more than he could have imagined. Rachel had been one of the brightest minds he'd known, and now she was sitting here, reduced to a shadow of the person she once was. "I didn't know," David whispered, guilt creeping into his voice. "If I had known—" "Known what?" Rachel interrupted, her tone sharp. "That I was out here? That my life fell apart? What would you have done, David? People like you walk by every day. They don't care. They don't even see us." David felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. She was right. He had walked past her for days without a second thought, and now, knowing what he did, he felt a deep, gnawing guilt that he couldn't shake. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have—" Rachel shook her head, cutting him off again. "It's too late for apologies, David. What's done is done." But as she said the words, David could sense that something deeper was buried beneath her bitterness. There was more to the story, something she wasn't telling him, and he was determined to find out. Over the next few days, David found himself returning to Rachel's corner again and again. Each time, he brought her food or water, small gestures that she accepted without much acknowledgement. She still kept her distance, her defenses high, but David could see that her resolve was beginning to crack. One afternoon, as they sat in silence, Rachel finally opened up a little more. Her words were slow, hesitant, as if she was still deciding whether or not to trust him. "There's something you don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David leaned in slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then, with a sigh, she spoke. "It wasn't just bad luck or bad decisions that brought me here," she said quietly. "There were people who helped me fall." David frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Rachel looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "The investors who pulled out of my company, they didn't just back out because I made a few mistakes. They were pushed," she paused, her voice trembling. "By you." David's blood ran cold. "What?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Rachel nodded, her eyes hard. "Your company was on the rise, and your board saw mine as a threat. They made sure I didn't get the funding I needed, and once I was vulnerable, it was over." David stared at her, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never personally made that decision, but if what Rachel said was true, then he had indirectly played a role in her downfall. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. Rachel scoffed, shaking her head. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy climbing to the top to notice the people you were stepping on." David felt the weight of her words pressing down on him like a boulder. He had spent his entire career building an empire, but in doing so, he had destroyed lives. Lives like Rachel's, and now she was sitting here, a living reminder of the cost of his success. "I don't know how to make this right," David said, his voice breaking. "But I want to try." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You can't fix this, David," she said quietly. "You can't undo the past." David swallowed hard, his chest tight with regret. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I can start by helping you now." Rachel didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said softly, "but don't think for a second that I trust you." David nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. The days that followed were filled with an awkward, tentative dance between David and Rachel. David did what he could, offering to find her a place to stay, arranging for doctors to check on her health, even reaching out to a few old contacts to see if there were any opportunities to help her restart her career. But each offer was met with the same guarded reluctance from Rachel. "I don't want your charity," she said more than once, her voice sharp but weary. "I'm not your project, David." David would nod, backing off. But he knew deep down that it wasn't just about charity. It was about making amends, about trying to right the wrongs he had been blind to for so many years. Rachel's fall had been orchestrated by people working on his behalf, whether he had been aware of it or not. And now that he knew the truth, he couldn't just walk away. Still, Rachel's pride kept her at a distance. Even though she accepted the small things, warm meals, clean clothes, David could feel the walls she had built around herself, and he knew it would take more than material help to break through them. One evening, after yet another offer of assistance had been rebuffed, Rachel finally opened up, though it wasn't in the way David had expected. They were sitting on a bench in a quiet part of the park, the sky growing dark around them. "You know, I didn't always hate you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Back in college, I actually admired you." David blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "You did?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Rachel nodded, staring out at the empty park. "You were one of the smartest people I knew. Driven, confident. I always thought you'd go far." David's heart sank as he realized just how far they had both fallen from those early days of ambition and promise. "I never knew you felt that way," he said quietly. Rachel shrugged, but there was a sadness in her eyes that belied her casual tone. "Well, things change. People change. It's funny, isn't it? How life takes you in directions you never expect." David looked at her, unsure of what to say. The person sitting next to him was a far cry from the bright, hopeful young woman he had once known. But despite everything, there was still a glimmer of that person inside her, buried beneath layers of pain and disillusionment. "I don't know what I can do to fix what happened," David said, his voice low. "But I want to help. I owe you that much." Rachel was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on the horizon. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh. "You want to help?" she said, her tone resigned. "Then don't just throw money at me. Help me get my life back." David nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. This wasn't just about providing material support. It was about helping her regain her dignity, her independence. It was about showing her that she wasn't alone anymore. "I will," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." The road ahead was anything but easy. Rachel's pride, hardened by years of struggle, made it difficult for her to accept help, even when she needed it most. But slowly, bit by bit, the barriers began to fall. David arranged for Rachel to stay in a small but comfortable apartment, far away from the streets she had called home for so long. He didn't push her to accept it right away, but after several days she finally agreed to move in. It was a modest start, but it marked a turning point in her journey back to stability. In the weeks that followed, David used his connections to find Rachel work, not in a charity case kind of way, but in a way that respected her intelligence and capabilities. It was a difficult process. Rachel was understandably wary of any offer that seemed too easy, too much like a handout. But eventually, she found herself working as a consultant for a small tech firm, a role that allowed her to use her skills without feeling like she was simply being given a free pass. Their relationship remained complicated. There were still moments of tension, of lingering bitterness. Rachel often kept her distance, and David knew that trust would take time to rebuild, if it ever could be fully restored. But for the first time in years, Rachel seemed to be moving forward. One day, as they sat together in the park where they had first begun to break through the barriers between them, Rachel looked over at David, a small, tentative smile on her face. "I didn't think I'd make it this far," she admitted softly. David smiled back, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. "You've always had it in you," he said. "You just needed someone to remind you." Rachel didn't respond right away, but there was something in her expression that told David she was beginning to believe it too. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but for the first time they were walking it together, not as a millionaire helping a homeless woman, but as two people trying to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. The story wasn't over. There were still scars that needed healing, still questions that had no easy answers. But as they sat there side by side, David realized that this was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally doing something that mattered.